Welcome, everyone, to the Trade Justice Alliance Sunday night webinar. Tonight's speakers, let me give you the topic first, the climate cost of free trade. Our speakers this evening are Ben Lilliston. He is with the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Anthony Vidal Torres, he is Associate Campaign Representative for Sierra Club's Responsible Trade Program. We have Nancy Price, co-chair of the Alliance for Democracy, and we have Adam Weissman, Director of Global Justice for Animals and the Environment. Our audio is phone only, and I want to give Andrea Miller a shout out. The meeting room is courtesy People Demanding Action, and Andrea is the Executive Director. You can visit our website at tradejustice.net, and I would now like to welcome Ben Lilliston. Ben is the Director of Corporate Strategies and Climate Change at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Ben has been working and writing about international trade issues and how they intersect with U.S. agricultural policy since 2000. And that includes multiple World Trade Organization ministerials, the passage of CAFTA, several farm bills, and now currently through trade debates. He recently authored the report, The Climate Cost of Free Trade, and Big Meat Swallows the TPP. He was also a contributor to the UN Committee on Trade and Development, Trade and Environmental Review 2013. The book Mandate for Change, and co-author of the book Genetically Engineered Foods, A Guide for Consumers. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks very much for having me. Can you hear me, everyone?
Yep, you're coming in loud and clear.
Okay, very good. Very good. As the first slide mentioned, I work at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. We're based in Minnesota. We've been around since the 1980s, and we've been tracking trade policy and global institutions and how they impact family farmers on the ground, how they impact rural communities, and how they impact our environment. So I'm going to just talk, give some overview issues around globalization, trade, and climate change. And I think some of the other speakers are going to dig in a little deeper on some of these issues. And I'm happy to dig in more on the Q&A, but this is going to be sort of an overview of some of the key issues. So I'll talk about how globalization impacts the climate, how trade agreements drive globalization. In other words, this is not just a system that we don't have any control over or haven't made decisions about over the years, how trade deals empower polluters, and how trade deals undermine renewable energy and sustainable agriculture, which is what we really zero in on. Great. So this is just a real simple slide making the simple point that this is from the World Trade Organization, and it just shows the fairly serious growth in global trade since the 1950s. And as many of you probably know, I know this is a fairly informed call, that after World War II, a number of global institutions were put into place, and one of those was a global agreement around tariffs and trade called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that set the rules and set sort of the basic framework for a modern trading system. And then in the 90s, things kind of went into hyperdrive, where NAFTA came into being and the World Trade Organization came into being. So we've always had trade in the history of civilizations and countries, but this is a different era. So I just wanted to make this point into this slide. And this different era has had a fairly significant impact in driving climate change. So what are some of the key ways in which trade and trade rules have driven climate change? Well, the most simplest and obvious is we got to move things, and we're moving things and products and manufactured goods all over the world. That requires fuel and energy. But one of the areas that we really look at is this natural resource extraction and how globalization and then trade rules enable that and facilitate that and have expanded that. So in the top picture is a system of agriculture, and we've just seen agricultural production around the world grow rapidly, and that form of agricultural production is highly energy intensive, requires a lot of fertilizer, a lot of machinery and fuel. In the case of animal production, you're talking about a lot of animal manure that is also a big greenhouse gas emitter. So it's a highly energy intensive form of agriculture that is expanding around the world. The lower left photo gives you an idea about deforestation that's taking place in different parts of the world. Again, global forest companies kind of see the world as their playground and are looking for forestry products around the world, but it's also linked to agriculture production. So a lot of the deforestation that you're seeing in the Amazon is linked to growth of agriculture, whether it's growth of soybean production or growth of meat production. And the largest meat producer in the world, JBS, just got fined for deforestation in Brazil over the last week. And then to the right is mining. And mining, again, very energy intensive. You have a small number of mining firms around the world, and trade rules give them power. A lot of the trade disputes are around mining, and these corporations have new powers within this sort of modern trade regime to challenge governments whenever governments say this system is polluting our water or causing problems for our local communities. This slide, I just wanted to make the point that the modern era of trade has also brought up a sort of a new issue, which is the offshoring of pollution. And by that, what I'm referring to is, the U.S., we've lost a lot of manufacturing in the United States, and that's been a big topic of discussion recently around trade. A lot of that manufacturing has moved to, say, Mexico or China, but the products that are being sold and produced are coming back to the United States. And so in many ways, not only are we offshoring jobs in some of these cases to find cheaper labor or lower environmental standards, but in the climate context, we're also offshoring our pollution. And that's one of those, I think, very difficult and challenging issues where climate change goals and trade goals are coming into conflict, and we're going to see that as an emerging issue in future trade debates. We can go to the next one. So when I say trade rules and what am I talking about, I know many of you know about this, but it's always worth talking about again. The World Trade Organization sets sort of the global standards, kind of the minimum standards of trade. So they have an agreement on agriculture, an intellectual property agreement. They look into things like services, procurement, investment. So they expanded the modern trade regime to go beyond just tariffs, which are when countries trade between each other and have taxes at the border. So the WTO is made up of most of the countries, I think 160 plus countries in the world, and it's a forum where they are constantly negotiating and trying to put together new agreements. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was one of the first big free trade agreements where you had a smaller number of countries, so not every country in the world, in this case just 3, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, who wanted to go further than WTO rules. We want to liberalize further. We want to shrink tariffs further. But we're also going to throw in some new things, and NAFTA includes the investor-state dispute system, settlement system, where corporations are granted special rights to challenge governments. And I know some of the other speakers will dig into what that is, but that was a new feature, and these sort of free trade area, local free trade agreements have pushed trade liberalization even further. And the TPP and the TTIP, the trade agreements with Europe and the trade agreement with a dozen Asian Pacific countries, both were sort of an extension of NAFTA. And now they're kind of on the back burner. TPP, the U.S. has notified that they won't be a part of that. Some of those countries are still talking about it. TTIP in Europe, definitely on the back burner, but we're not sure whether that agreement is done or not. We'll find out. But both are sort of an extension of NAFTA in that free trade model of going further than WTO rules. And then it's worth mentioning TISA, which is the Trade and Services Agreement. That is a global agreement that is covering, and they call services, telecommunications, but also energy. It's a really wide-ranging global agreement that is being discussed. And again, that one's kind of stalled a little bit, and the whole Trump administration is making things murky about how the U.S. will engage, but that could have major implications for the climate as well. I think it's worth pointing out at the WTO, we're seeing more and more disputes over energy and renewable energy in particular. So Ontario had a solar program that was struck down several years ago because it required local purchasing. In other words, to be eligible for the program, you had to purchase locally for your solar panels and some of the solar-related products. India just had a program struck down at the WTO, with the U.S. being the main challenger. And now India has brought a similar challenge to several U.S. states because, as you may know, several U.S. states, we live in Minnesota. Minnesota has a solar program that also has one of these local content requirements. In order for owners and companies to get rebates, they have to purchase from Minnesota businesses. The WTO says you can't do that. And I think one of the interesting things here is that in the India case, India said, we need this program to meet our global climate commitments that we agreed to in Paris. And the WTO said, we don't care about that. Your WTO rules take precedent over your global climate agreement commitments. So we're going to see more and more of these energy disputes at the WTO, and there's a lot of people talking about how do we resolve this, because there's a clear conflict. We can go to the next slide. I'm almost done here. In agriculture, which is the area that we really look at deeply, some of the big areas where climate change intersects is the lowering of tariffs, which is a key part of almost all trade agreements, has facilitated what is called agricultural dumping, which is the export of agricultural products at below their cost of production. So the U.S. has been proficient at this particular practice, U.S. agribusiness companies, because the way our farm bill is set up, we routinely overproduce things like corn and soybean, sometimes wheat, sometimes rice, and those prices for those products will drop below the cost of production. And we subsidize our farmers so they can keep farming. But the agribusiness companies can buy those products up at a very cheap price and then export it. And the impact of that is, so for example, Mexico under NAFTA lost around 2 million corn farmers, because we dumped a whole bunch of corn down there. So the impact of that from a climate perspective is, one, we reinforce this energy-intensive industrial system of agriculture here that is greenhouse gas emitting, but we also shift the agricultural production system in the other countries that we're trading with. So in order for Mexico to compete, they're going to also have to, from a price standpoint, they're also going to have to adopt that industrial model of production, and they have done that. Intellectual property is another central part of a lot of free trade agreements, and also at the WTO. This allows biotech companies to more power in the patenting of seeds. And the seeds that they are most interested in are seeds that are part of this industrial model of production. So again, trade rules are helping to lock in an industrial system of production that's highly greenhouse gas polluting. CAFO stands for Confined Animal Feeding Operations, and I think one of the other speakers is going to dig into that more, but these confined operations, as opposed to in that picture sort of a grazing situation, it's where you have a lot of animals and usually inside or in feedlots in a confined space, producing a lot of manure, more manure than the land can handle. So these giant manure pits are emitting large amounts of a very potent greenhouse gas called methane. That model is expanding in the U.S., but it's also expanding in other parts of the world. And last, food safety. This is an issue also that helps facilitate global agribusiness, by setting up a trade agreement where you have common food safety rules, often pushing down those food safety rules, in other words, weakening them to facilitate trade as opposed to actually protecting food safety. This is another important tool for global agribusiness and their industrial model. So I'll stop there for that slide. Yeah, and I just wanted to mention, and some of the other speakers will dig in, the trade rules have expanded fossil fuel production and the trade of fossil fuel production. So in TTIP, Europe was very interested in getting access to our natural gas production and had sort of won that concession in the early rounds of TTIP. Under the TPP agreement, Japan is the largest natural gas importer in the world, and they won that concession also from the United States. We can move on. So what is needed? Well, obviously, in very simple terms, we need a new approach on trade that considers the impacts of climate change from the outset. Trade rules should not override climate concerns. And I think Anthony's going to dig into a lot more specifics. Sierra Club has been a leader in really thinking through, okay, what would that look like? What are some of the details of that?
Great, thanks, Ben. I'm sure we all have our worries about Trump and his with respect to climate and trade. So thank you very much. Stick around for the Q&A. I appreciate it. And I now would like to introduce Anthony Vidal Torres. Anthony is Associate Campaign Representative for Sierra Club's Responsible Trade Program. He's a member of the Climate Justice Working Group, an advisory board member of the California Trade Justice Coalition. Anthony joined the Sierra Club in the spring of 2016 to organize the club's field campaign against the TPP. He is originally from Long Island, New York, and his work is focused on how to build new movements and new politics for climate justice. He's recently been featured as one of GRIS.org's top 50 fixers for 2017 for his cross-movement building for a united multiracial front. Welcome, Anthony.
Thank you so much. If there's any problems on my end with hearing my voice, please put that in the chat box.
You sound great.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Well, thank you, and thank you to Ben and for the Trade Justice Alliance for welcoming me onto this webinar. Happy to be here. And so, as Ben was mentioning, our trade system is not only unsustainable, it is also unjust. And so we need to fight for a progressive vision for trade that takes into account climate justice, good and high-paying jobs, clean air and water, and supports healthy communities. And here at the Sierra Club's trade team, we've been developing one plank of that, which is a climate-friendly approach to trade, especially when it comes to the upcoming battle over NAFTA renegotiation. And so, as has been mentioned, Trump is going to be negotiating NAFTA, but it's not going to be on behalf of the environment, of our movements. In many ways, there are threats that he can make NAFTA even worse of a corporate power grab. And so on this slide, you see that for our standard, the first thing that comes to a new approach to trade is eliminating the private tribunals that allow corporations to extract money from taxpayers and sue our government before these private corporate lawyers in order to seek retribution for bans on toxic chemicals, moratoriums on fracking, and any social or environmental policies that threaten their future profits. And as of this point, they've extracted more than $370 million from governments through free trade agreements. This is a process called the Investor-State Dispute Settlement, ISDS, and pending NAFTA claims are now between $35 and $50 billion. And I will just take a point here to give an update on the TransCanada case, which was the company that's created is now attempting to build again the Keystone XL pipeline. They sued the Obama administration when the president rejected the pipeline after our movements pushed him to do so. And Donald Trump reversed that decision just this past month, and within an hour, TransCanada dropped its $15 billion NAFTA ISDS suit. And so this demonstrates just how threatening these suits can be and how ISDS undermines democratic governance. And in fact, TransCanada's threat to continue the NAFTA suit contributed to Trump reneging on his promise that the pipeline be made with U.S. steel. And so now I'll just go on to the next part of our platform, which is safeguarding our energy and environmental regulations. So at the current NAFTA model, and the energy chapter limits Canada's ability to restrict the production of tar sands and other products in the Alberta region. And this is because of what is written has been written by the corporate advisors inside the rooms of the trade deal negotiations. And other rules from NAFTA restrict renewable energy portfolios, anything from car emission standards to limits on fossil fuel development and export that challenge any local or regional government from listening to their constituents who are often fighting now to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And so our solutions are to eliminate the energy chapter entirely, not have these free trade agreements infringe on public policy for our climate, narrow the offending rules that are in those agreements, and create a carve-out, which is a shield to protect, that will provide an exemption at the very least for any policies that aim to protect our climate and environment. So sort of preventing what Ben highlighted, where the WTO ignores our Paris climate agreements in favor of trade rules. In fact, and with this new approach, we would be preventing that situation from happening. And in addition to protecting what we already have, we want to be enforcing even stronger ambition when it comes to environmental and labor standards. Right now, NAFTA has very weak and unenforceable standards. It has led to very weak standards in Mexico, in which many Mexicans didn't even get all the manufacturing jobs that were promised and are yet faced with very anti-union and anti-worker conditions and very low wages. And at the same time, this has also now weakened the union and labor movement in the United States. So our solutions are to require each country to adopt, maintain, and implement the policies that were laid out in Paris within their international trade agreements. Outright require that all participating trade countries eliminate their subsidies for fossil fuels and make that enforceable via dispute settlement systems that are open to government as well as civil society. The next step is to penalize the imports of climate-heavy products that are produced with very low environmental standards, that are often made in dangerous conditions and made cheaply, and that allow firms to shift production and offshore their emissions, as Ben was mentioning. And so our solution is to require that each country impose a border tax on imported goods made with significant climate pollution. So this helps create greater climate action among participating trade partners. It's very different from what sort of many of the Republicans or Trump had mentioned with the border tax. This is an across-the-board different approach that is basing the product on what was made to go into that product towards our environment and overall pollution. This is sort of putting in the social cost of carbon. So when it comes to green purchasing and procurement, the federal and state and local governments have a huge role in literally just using their financial power and their pocketbook and taxpayer dollars to create and invest in different trade products. So NAFTA's procurement rules limit the government's ability to use green or local purchasing such as what Minnesota and other states have been developing that support renewable energy and energy efficiency. And so it creates this debate for it creates this paradox where governments may have a policy, but they are forced under NAFTA and otherwise to prioritize trade over climate. And so our solution for a new trade approach is to require that governments prioritize green purchasing and procurement and local renewable energy procurement in all of their financial decisions. And one of our last planks is especially keen with NAFTA is restricting trucking emissions, which was a huge issue in the 90s debates of the original NAFTA. Right now, NAFTA has encouraged a rise of cross-border motor carrier traffic without doing anything to regulate the harmful emissions that come from these trucks moving across Canada, Mexico, or the U.S. It has not created a standardized way to make sure that we are creating more efficient vehicles and also mitigating the impacts along the border to our environment and those communities at the forefront of these emissions. For instance, Detroit, in a predominantly Black and Latino neighborhood, they are building several bridges to meet the demand for trucking from Canada. However, those communities have been forced to close their schools, their public schools, because the pollution to the children has been so bad. And so our solution is that any deal that replaces NAFTA requires cross-border trucks to reduce emissions in order to get their goods to market.
Okay,
all right, well,
great.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Now what we're going to do is open it up for questioning. Meanwhile, I'm going to ask a question I'll ask either speaker that wants to take it. My understanding is that Trump's trade team is using sort of a TPP framework in renegotiating NAFTA, and I'm wondering if the environmental standards of the TPP would have actually been worse than what was in NAFTA.
If the environmental standards in the TPP were worse than the current NAFTA?
Right.
Is your question? Yeah, I mean, I think what they tried to do, and Anthony also, no Sierra Club dug into this too, is to say that the TPP was providing stronger environmental standards, and there's some decent language in there. The problem is that language has also been in a number of previous U.S. free trade agreements, and it's never really been enforced. And it's always been kind of the enforcement issue, is our country's going to enforce those standards. Are they going to give it equal weight that they do in supporting corporate challenges to trade rules? And they haven't done that. And so the TPP is really another example of what we see where, environmental protections are kind of off to the side, and the enforcement issues are not, power is not there. And so this is kind of what they've slid into the NAFTA, at least the initial extremely kind of bullet point level proposals that they've had on NAFTA.
And I'll just add that on the TPP, the environmental standards seemed on paper a little better in the environmental and labor standards section than NAFTA. However, we know that as Ben mentioned, they were nearly all voluntary or unenforceable. There was no track record of enforcement from some of the actors. And in fact, other chapters of the agreement were undermining those protections by, for instance, one aspect had said, they were encouraging folks to reduce wildlife trafficking. But at the same time, another chapter said that they would reduce tariffs on shark fins. And so in many ways, these trade agreements are not at all designed for our environment or our communities.
Great. So they're just aspirational, not really enforceable. Terry, are you going to, or do we have anyone in the chat box that has a question?
I'm going to do it here. Can you hear me?
Yep. Go for it.
Okay, yeah. Great. So we have a bunch of questions. Let's start with a question from Victor. Victor asks, Anthony, what about hydrogen mandates to power ships and trucks?
Yeah, great. So when it comes to shipping, the planks of our platform that I mentioned that had to do with the import taxes as well as the example with trucking is a way that we believe trade tax can be used to tackle climate pollution from shipping. And so the tax would incorporate all the emissions and social cost of carbon that came from shipping for that product to make it from whatever country it was made in to the consumer. And lastly, that's a great idea with hydrogen. That is an idea that we are still looking into, and we know that many scientific and civil society bodies are looking into. And in many ways, some of those taxes and revenue could be used to raise those standards and discourage climate polluting conditions, which would elevate the demand for alternatives like hydrogen.
Thanks. Adam, is there another question?
Okay, our next question comes from Sherilyn, and her question is there a possibility that reduction in subsidies can specify transferring that money to funding for renewable energy projects, preferably at the local level? And she does not specify who that's for, so either or both of you are welcome to take a crack at it.
This is Anthony, and absolutely, Sherilyn. Our platform calls for, in addition to eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, having governments be required to use their procurement policies to support local renewable energy projects. So exactly that.
Ben, do you want to add anything, or should we move on to the next question?
Yeah, let's move on.
Okay, great. Our next question is from Coralie, who asks, how much info do we have on Trump's recently announced plans on revamping NAFTA?
Well, this is Ben. I can talk briefly. So we don't have a lot of information. Part of it seems to be there's a little bit of a infighting within the Trump administration and different factions of different ideas about trade. And then the other issue, of course, is that they haven't confirmed the new U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer. So there's a little murkiness on who exactly is in charge right now. But what we did see this last week was an initial sort of draft letter to Congress and the committees that oversee trade, outlining what their initial sort of trade objectives would be in NAFTA. And again, this was not in any super detail. It was in very Trump form, and bullet points, sort of generalities, and difficult to really know what, in trade the details are really important. So, but what we do know is a lot of the pieces that were in there, from what you could see, did seem to come from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. While Trump had bashed that agreement during the campaign, there seemed to be some acknowledgement that there are some parts of it that they agree with. One of the bigger areas that is also, ill-defined that is different than the TPP is they want more flexibility to apply tariffs when they feel like another country is what they call dumping or getting an advantage in trade. And so they want to grant the president more flexibility and power to act immediately. I think this is mostly feeding in towards Trump's kind of ideas around we're somehow getting ripped off in these trade agreements, and certain companies from other countries are taking advantage of us, even though the evidence doesn't necessarily support that. But, so that's what we know now. We'll get more details, as I would expect, as the U.S. Trade Rep is confirmed and they make a more formal submission to Congress about their intent to start renegotiations. I don't know, Anthony, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add that the majority of Trump's cabinet is full of TPP supporters, and/or folks who come from Wall Street and have supported the corporate trade agenda. And the rest of them are economic nationalists who support Trump's rhetoric from the campaign trail that tied trade to be used as a weapon against immigrants or against, framing it as Mexico versus the U.S., and so both of those visions don't equate to negotiating a new NAFTA that supports our environment or working people. And that's exactly why, we're calling for progressives to fill this vacuum since TPP.
Carrie, can you see if anyone else is in the queue?
There was
Any other questions?
One more question. Basically, do you think we have any prayer to save the environment with Trump as head?
Who is the question from?
I think to either one of them.
No, who is it? Who typed it in?
I'm sorry. The question is from Lorna.
Okay. Either or of you could take a stab at it.
Do we have a prayer? I'll just say real quickly. I think we do, and primarily not that we're going to get anything from Trump, because I think he has such a strong anti-environmental agenda, and as Anthony put it, an anti sort of justice and fairness agenda. But there is what we are seeing is there's a lot of incompetence within the Trump administration. Their ability to move forward a trade agreement, I think, is really we need to challenge it. There are opportunities for us to challenge his vision of trade, and I think there are real opportunities for us to win and push back. And you are seeing, particularly in the environmental arena and the climate arena, a lot of activity in states now and state governments and even local governments speaking up. And the more that happens and the more power that builds, the more is an opportunity to not only sort of blunt Trump's push for his very corporate-oriented vision of trade, but also to, I think, strengthen the environmental movement. So that's kind of the optimistic view that I would give.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Anthony, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would definitely resonate with that. And I would just add that, it's going to be on our movements to develop a trade policy, a new trade approach that's for people and planet. It's not going to be, we have to remain vigilant, and if Trump delivers another corporate trade deal, we'll have to make sure it meets the same fate as the TPP. And in the end, this is going to require us defeating Trump in 4 years. And as Ben mentioned, in the meantime, building our power at the local and state level so that in 4 years from now, because trade is very national and internationally focused, we can have our vision ready to replace a failed corporate status quo and also reject Trump's nationalist and false solutions.
Great. Thank you both very much. Appreciate it. I know you're both very busy.
Harry, there was actually one other question. Yeah,
okay.
There's a question from Rachel. Rachel asked, can we increase transparency and debate of drafts in Congress?
This is Anthony.
And
in our platform, one of our planks is calling for, as some other countries in Europe do right now, is allowing for all drafts of trade deals to be released after every round publicly rather than being kept in secret until it's brought before Congress. And second, we want to reform the corporate advisory system, and which right now the U.S. Trade Representative is advised during trade negotiations by hundreds of mostly advisors from corporations or the corporate sector, and very few from labor or environmental or civil society. And so we actually, called Trump's bluff and said, if you're really about changing the way, trade agreements are made, get rid of the corporate advisory system, which he hasn't done and we don't expect him or Lighthizer to do. And so, at the core, it's getting rid of this corporate advisory system and having civil society, labor, and others in the room when these trade agreements are negotiated, and making sure the public has access to every draft after each negotiating round.
Great. Ben, did you want to add something to that?
I would just add that members of Congress are very nervous about the Trump administration, and you're seeing signs of them trying to assert a little bit more control over the process. And so hopefully that will also be an avenue to bring greater transparency, because I agree that is a fundamental issue and a fundamental reason why our trade policy has failed. So hopefully we'll see Congress stepping up a little bit.
Great. Thank you both so much. Appreciate it. I know you're both very busy. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Now I would like to introduce our friend Nancy Price. Nancy is co-chair of the Alliance for Democracy. She's an editor of the Alliance for Democracy's magazine, Justice Rising, Grassroots Solutions to Corporate Power. AFD's current issue is The People's Vote Must Count, Reclaim Elections, Restore Voting Rights, Protect Our Ballots. Nancy was a founding member of Move to Amend also. Currently, she's board member of National Election Defense Coalition, Liberty Tree Foundation, California Trade Justice Alliance, and Earth Democracy Group, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom with the U.S. section. Welcome, Nancy.
Hello. Thank you, Harriet and Adam, for inviting me on. You both, and most of those on the call maybe, know me for the Alliance for Democracy work in our TPP, no TPP resolutions, and working on trade over the past years. But this topic that I'm introducing today, while you may think that it seems a new avenue for me, which it is in some ways, it's about the same issues of sovereignty, democracy, human rights, and economic, social, environmental, and climate justice. And the reason I'm turning to this is I recently was at the United Nations for a week during the Commission on the Status of Women, and the theme this year was the economy. And I began to think about, to educate myself about what was going on at the UN in regard to information and articles I'd seen over the past few years about the encroaching corporate influence at the UN. So hence my focus today, expanding the corporate coup, takeover of the UN and the U.S. government. Of course, corporate coup has been used in the past when we've talked about the trade agreements. But this is a new direction, really, for corporate influence at the UN, and also this most recent action of Trump to appoint his son-in-law to this new White House government White House initiative. So, as our two former speakers emphasized, we really need to work toward a free trade agenda that protects people and the planet. But we also need to look out to how the corporations and corporate influence is infiltrating the UN in such a way that it is going to make it harder and harder to realize the goals that I just mentioned of sovereignty, democracy, and economic, social, political, climate, environmental justice, as the UN could realize those goals. So this is sort of a text-heavy presentation. So forgive me, I don't have pretty pictures of trees and fields. But in any event, I want to sort of bring to your attention the beginning, a sort of beginning of when this corporate influence began to creep into and also be brought into the UN. One beginning is, if we just look at 2000, is when the United Nations Global Compact was announced. It was called the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. So there you see the word corporate and sustainability coming together in a way that had not been so emphasized before. It's described as this voluntary initiative on CEO commitments. So that's corporate executive commitments to implement universal sustainable principles and take steps to support the UN goals. You might remember that the Millennial Development Goals were concluded in 2015, and they are then extended under the Sustainable Development Goals to 2030. So this global compact is meant to help push through those Sustainable Development Goals. It was adopted in 2000 at a Millennial Summit at the UN, where 189 leaders in the General Assembly adopted the Millennial Development Goals to be achieved by 2015. When you look at that at those goals, they're meant to recognize these various United Nations instruments, but as I go on, you'll see that bringing the corporations into the UN and cooperating with corporate agendas, in my estimation at least, and others who've written the articles that I'll be referencing, have very serious questions about this new sort of alliance between corporations and the UN. Next, please. So one of the first critiques occurred in 2009 with this article, Corporate Stranglehold. It came out of the fact that the Fifth World Water Forum took place in Istanbul, which is put on every 3 years by the World Water Council. So the World Water Forum has been very involved over the years in laying out an agenda for helping to provide drinking water and sanitation services through, generally, privatization. So the Global Water Justice Government movement called for states in the UN system to develop a global water forum based on principles of democracy, full participation, equity, transparency, and social inclusion within the framework of the United Nations, and to recognize water as a human right. Immediately, the global water corporations and others said that if this global water forum was set up under the UN, that it would not be an inclusive forum, because they would not have status at the UN to be included. Then one of the most important documents is this World Economic Forum Global Redesign document, which I'll come to a little bit later in my presentation. But it was the first really important statement about the role of a new governance system that recognized the importance of corporations being included in United Nations deliberations. Then comes in 2011 these reflections on the G20 and the crisis of global economic governance. This is after the financial and housing crises that hit not only the U.S. but Europe in particular. And the G20 were trying to deal with these crises, meeting in Cannes, and at the same time, civil society was meeting in Nice at a people's forum. And they laid out what they called was a new common agenda for system change. They wanted to go beyond the authority of the World Bank, the IMF, and the principles of austerity and structural adjustment that had so impacted many of the European and East European countries. So that was really another very important statement by global civil society in beginning to really critique this corporatization of the UN. Then comes this 2011 critique. The subtitle is How Big Business Has Seized Control of Climate Negotiations. So we all know how the global climate summits have been so controversial with nation states in deliberations, civil society in many instances sort of locked out, not being able to have their voices heard, and the corporations setting up exhibitions and lobbying very hard for their position at these climate talks. So this is also a very important critique. And what I want to say is if you just Google these references that I mentioned here, you'll find articles very easily. The next really important stage is 2012, when there was this important Rio Plus 20 People's Summit, which was instituted because the Millennium Development Goals were going to end in 2015, and it was time to lay out a new phase of development goals. So the UN, this was a UN conference on sustainable development with a resolution titled The Future We Want, and it began the process of laying out the sustainable development goals that were later adopted. But what's important about this is that international civil society put out a call for international action against transnational corporations, and they launched a campaign to stop corporate impunity. They designed a global campaign to dismantle corporate power and end impunity, and they created an international people's treaty on transnational corporations to be presented to nation-state bodies and international bodies to begin to get a conversation going about how to really assert authority over corporations and their actions. We then move in 2014 to a more intense stage of critique, which is leading up to the People's Climate March in September 2014 and to the Paris COP21 meetings in late November, December of 2015. So these are some more of the critiques that are important because there were various climate negotiations going on, and there was a sense that going into Paris, there would be such corporate influence on those talks that there was a need now to expose that corporate influence and to expose the need for the Paris COP21 to really be effective and really begin to lay out how to tackle global warming and climate change. So the next sort of conjunction there is not only the People's Climate March, but in September 2015, 194 countries of the UN General Assembly adopt the 2030 Development Agenda of Sustainable Development Goals called Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Something interesting then happens, which is sort of a clue to how corporations are beginning to position themselves at the UN. UN agencies under the umbrella of the UN Development Group decide to support an individual campaign to communicate what they called Project Everyone, global goals supported by corporate institutions rather than international organizations. This Project Everyone was developed and endorsed without the member states participating. And they leave out, as you might have heard, the word sustainability. So you begin to see a new kind of messaging taking place in this sort of United Nations process. Next, please. So as I mentioned, we get to the Paris climate talks, and then we wait a year, more or less, when the corporations achieve a great victory at the UN. Just a year later, December 2016, 193 members of the UN General Assembly vote to give International Chamber of Commerce observer status at the General Assembly. So here are the comments made, and you can see that the ICC chairman calls this vote historic, unprecedented, stresses the long cooperation with the United Nations, huge recognition of the role that business can play in contributing to a better and peaceful world, et cetera, et cetera. And the stress here is that the corporate sector can work with governments and civil society to work hand in hand in realizing the UN goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. The ICC General Secretary, the ICC has a long tradition of close cooperation. Given the complexity of today's global challenges, it's vital that business has a clear voice in UN decision-making. We look forward to using this unique platform to develop fully the resources, expertise, and knowledge of world business in the work of the General Assembly. I might just say that already the ICC and some other organizations had consultative status with the UN Economic and Social Council, but clearly this wasn't enough for the ICC. Here's Peter M. Robinson, next slide. Oh, you've got it. President and CEO of the United States Council for International Business, saying they'd strongly supported that effort. So you begin to see U.S. business interests collaborating with international business interests. So let's go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in September 2015, just before the Climate Summit. The countries adopted a set of 17 goals to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure prosperity for all. Each goal has specific targets to be achieved over the next 15 years to 2030. So let me just point out some of these goals that are so important to people across the planet, and especially emerging and developing countries. But I'd like to just emphasize that the Sustainable Development Goals were approved or signed by the United States, the United Nations, and so these goals also apply to the U.S. And there might be ways, I believe, that we can try to hold the U.S. to some of these sustainable goals that are so important even to many of our disadvantaged and struggling communities in this country. So I don't have a slide for this. I'm sorry. I got it to Harriet a little bit late. A little late after I worked on it this morning. But, for example, one goal is eradicate extreme poverty. Another is reduce hunger to, they call it, zero hunger. Now, if we think of the presentations by Bill and Anthony, we realized the question is, how is hunger to be reduced? Is it going to be reduced by allowing corporate ag to come into these countries as they're doing in India right now? Challenging peasant farming, trying to introducing corporate ag models that we know are having such an impact on land, air, water, and climate. Another goal is clean water and sanitation. Already that's been a huge problem in many of developing, third world and developing countries, where the private sector has come in under the World Bank, the IMF, and been allowed to, through the corporate sector, provide clean water and sanitation, and then finding that water rates went up, labor was impacted. There were many, many problems with the privatization agenda in water and sanitation. So how will the UN, with this corporate influence, realize this particular goal when, in fact, if we make clean water for personal household use and good sanitation, how does that affect reducing poverty, for example, as it would impact household budgets? There's a climate action goal 13. There's goal 12 is responsible consumption and production. Goal 17 is partnerships for realizing these goals. Strengthen the sort of description of that is strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnerships for sustainable development. Global partnerships is now the new sort of mantra that the corporate sector is to be at the table along with civil society and with nation-state governments in collaborating on how these sustainable development goals will be realized. The discussion is now around the fact that traditional governance, that is, global governance that nation states work with or is at the core of the UN system, is old-fashioned. It is limited in its ability and its scope. And that with the 2008-9 economic and financial crisis, the World Economic Forum was arguing, coming out of its global redesign, that the nation-state and the UN system is only now just one part of this global governance system. Next, please. So what needs to be then part of this new global governance system? It's the corporation. And here are some of the statements that give you the language that the global redesign that was released by the World Economic Forum in 2010 is using to describe what this new global corporate governance looks like. And in particular, with the International Chamber of Commerce being given observer status at the United Nations, you can see that it's been a many years effort to finally achieve that status and be at the table at the UN in almost as an equal partner. Next, please. So just very briefly, I don't know if you realize that Jared Kushner has been given the directorship, I guess you'd say, of the White House Office of American Innovation. And this is what he said. If it didn't appall you, it certainly appalled me. The government should be run like an American company. Our hope is that we can achieve success and efficiencies for our customers, who are the citizens. He stresses that the sort of concept of non-ideological ideas factory is going to be this kind of non-ideological ideas factory, capable of attracting top talent from both inside and outside government, serving as a conduit with the business, philanthropic, and academic communities. This is sort of a heads up, because we know that philanthropic endeavors, such as the Gates Foundation, is heavily invested in Africa and pushing corporate ag into Africa. So many of these philanthropic organizations, foundations, have an agenda that matches the corporate agenda. So they're very, we have to keep our eye on them very carefully. And we do know academic communities are very much indebted to both the philanthropic as well as the corporate kind of financing that they get to do their research. So, for example, here at University of California, Davis, where I live in Davis, we have something called the World Food Institute. And this is funded by Gates and Monsanto, and it allows the World Food Institute to be part of this pushing into Africa to solve the global food security problem. And they fund a great deal of research in life sciences and agriculture at the university, so that academic institutions, as we know very well, are captured by corporate and foundation money to do the business of corporations. So this White House framing is, of course, going to be their selling point of the advantage of this office in the White House. They're going to float above the daily political grind and get results. They're going to move beyond government stagnation. What policies are adding to ferret out what policies are adding friction without benefits. The private sector can quickly identify these friction points, which of course means deregulation. The congestion, cost overruns, delays, it's all government's fault. The private sector can and will do better. With prudent budget cuts, this initiative will get more out of less dollars, doing things smarter, better, and leaning on the private sector. So this, of course, leads us to the privatization agenda, which is, of course, part of the free trade agreements and very much part of the trade and services agreement, which is really would lead to privatization of any part of the public sector that remains public. So what I want to emphasize is to come back to the 2012 statement at the Earth Summit Plus 20, which is when this global campaign to dismantle corporate power and end impunity was launched. I really think that we must begin to build this sort of movement of movements that's coming together. It's coalescing in the U.S., but we still have a ways to go to really have a coherent, multidimensional, multi-factional movement that could provide a kind of broad, single agenda to resist this kind of corporate influence at the White House and at the UN, and really reclaim our position as stakeholders and citizens and not consumers, so that we can begin to really put people and planet over profit. Thank you very much. Oh, I just wanted to bring your attention to our Justice Rising magazine, which you can go to the alliancefordemocracy.org and order. And then for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, I helped create this Climate Justice, Women, and Peace infographic card, which you could also just Google that title, and you'll find it comes up on the Internet, and you can order that card, perhaps for the Climate March on April 29. So I just wanted to, I've been developing this investigation of the corporate influence of the UN to show that this is another avenue that I think we have to really pay careful attention to. It's they're couching it now in terms of this governance, this sort of mantra about governance, and we have to push back and really talk about democracy, sovereignty, human rights, and justice issues, and raise these issues up, not just in terms of the free trade agreements, but in terms of how the UN is really going to address the needs of all people and not just the needs of corporate financial investors. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nancy. Nancy, your talk was really good, and it was very substantial. So I am thinking maybe would you like to answer questions now, or would you prefer to wait until after Adam gives his talk?
No, I'll answer questions now. I think that's a very good idea. Thank you.
Okay. Adam, are you awake? Can you do the chat box? If you have any questions for Nancy, put Nancy's name in the chat box and then ask your question, please. It's really, really very interesting to me. All these issues intersect with each other. You know, we really are in a crisis of global corporate rule right now. So if you have a question for Nancy, Put it in the chat.
We have one from Lorna. Lorna says, Nancy, what happened to the people's voice? Why can't we one-up them?
Well, I think we're beginning to, but I do think that, the people's movement in Europe, in watching them fight back against the TTIP and TISA, and the fact that they can get out, 500,000 people or 10,000, 500,000 people at a march, and the fact that there's a tradition of understanding, of political understanding from the, Marxist, socialist, labor spectrum that I think is much stronger than in the U.S. now, that, the people's movement there is very strong. And I think we have to really put together a very strong a multi-sectoral, very diverse people's movement here in the country now. It's beginning to come together, but I think we're still working in, sort of sectorally. We're working on ag, or we're working on policing, and we're working on gender issues, and we're working on education, or we're working on environmental climate. And somehow I think we need to lift up a framing that's not just people and planet, but because I was at the UN this last couple of weeks ago for the whole week, I was very impressed and inspired by the UN frame of human rights, civil and political rights, social, political, economic, and climate justice. And I think if we could lift up this framing and then, have our points under that framing, both for the trade agreements, both for fair trade, and for what we would like to see the UN body be able to deliver on and call out this corporate, camel's nose. But what's a bit discouraging is that I believe it was Belgium, France, and about 20 nation states that introduced allowing the ICC to come in to have observer status at the General Assembly. So what I came to learn is that in all of these documents and resolutions that eventually get passed at the UN, there are many years of back office, backroom meetings, talks, draft documents, discussions, etc. Finally, you then read a resolution, for example, this ICC resolution to give them observer status. But the work on that must have begun 5-6 years ago. So you then see this sort of eruption of, that past backroom discussions, like the secret trade talks on that we've been criticizing, come to fruition. So I just that's why I ended with my last sort of call to action. I would love to see some kind of facilitation of bringing this sort of people's, really a very vigorous people's movement into some kind of coherence in the U.S. in the near future.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question comes from Trish, who says, Nancy, please talk about the issue of water, Maud Barlow's Blue Gold.
Yes, well, for people who don't know, Maud Barlow, who is president, I guess she is, of the Council of Canadians, and for years, the Council of Canadians, 20 years almost now, has been at the forefront of making the case that water must be kept in public hands, that we cannot allow privatization as happened in the late 1990s, coming out of Seattle 99, the forward movement on water privatization throughout Central and South America was very fierce and actually had huge impacts. And in 2000, many of you know about Cochabamba, when the Bechtel Corporation was intent privatizing water services in Cochabamba, and there were demonstrations and riots. One protester was killed. There was an international lawsuit, but then Bechtel finally dropped out. But South America is really targeted early on. Then the United States was targeted next for a while, and some of those privatizations were either stopped or were reclaimed back into the private sector. And there are many, many other cases, and the Council of Canadians and Maud were just very much in the leadership of exposing these, critiquing them, and trying to assist communities and large cities in resisting privatization. Council of Canadians has now, again, a campaign against bottled water. This time it's against Nestle. You can go up to Council of Canadians, I think, click on water or bottled water and sign their pledge. Nestle is now regrouping and is coming back very strong in many countries here in the U.S. and many sites to again take water for bottling. And there's a lot of local resistance going on, but it's very, it's very discouraging. It's tough to get these bottled water companies out of your community water. In fact, there's several communities, many communities have passed local ordinances that the water cannot be taken out, and some of those communities have gone back and established the rights of nature through an ordinance. But we're really finding now that we have to probably relaunch a bottled water campaign here in the U.S., and we also have to really be very clear that with the cutback in federal and state funds to local communities that are cash-strapped, they're now looking at water privatization. They're looking at long-term leases, and privatization, as we know, is the wrong direction to go. We should go toward public-public partnerships. That is, where a local community is having problems with upgrading or providing public water and sanitation, they go to another community where they have a very good public water system, and they learn from each other. The one teaches the other, and you don't have to cave into the mantra of the private water corporations that they know better, they can make efficiencies, they can deliver the goods, whatever they say, because what they do is they don't do that. Water costs go up, they reduce their labor, or they get rid of union labor, and there are many boiled water days, or as we know in Flint, for example, there are terrible issues of lead poisoning, and lead poisoning of water is really ubiquitous across the U.S., ubiquitous. And with Trump's new infrastructure program, we're going to have a huge push for privatization. So we have to really develop our critique here to push back against that agenda of his.
Thank you. Adam, is anyone else in the queue?
Nope, that's it. That was the last question for Nancy, unless someone else wants to write one right now. But wait, let's see. There's April. That was a more internal comment to the chat.
We'll take one more question because it is getting late.
Okay, here's a question from Kit, who says, "Where can we find the Movement of Movements Center, Popular Resistance?" That was a question mark.
Well, I think if you just Google popularresistance.org, you'll see many materials there. If you go back, I don't think you can go back to the slide now, but the movement that I was referencing is www.stopcorporateimpunity.org. That is the international movement. So I think that with Ben's and Anthony's presentation on how to develop a solutions agenda for fair trade, that we can develop a solutions agenda for a people's movement based on human rights, and the justice agenda that we need for the U.S. in particular. And I look forward to maybe somebody beginning to take up that agenda.
Thank
you very much. I've just begun to work on this material, so I'm a little bit. I'm putting it together. So thank you very much for your interest and for your indulgence. I think it's something that we really have to look at.
You can take those slides and add more slides to them. And what we'll do is we'll have the slides available on our Trade Justice Alliance Facebook group, and in a few days, Carrie will put out the YouTube video. So thanks very much, Nancy. That was really great. Great, everybody. We're now going to hear from Adam. He is the co-director of Global Justice for Animals and the Environment, and he is a member of the Trade Justice New York Metro organization. And as you know, Adam and I and others, Carrie and Mara and some other people are partners in putting together these webinars and have been for years. So let's hear from Adam.
Hi, everyone. Oh, wow, the text from that slide is missing.
What happened? Oh, well, you'll have to fill us in.
Yeah, that was a black slide, I guess, when it got imported, the white text became invisible. Okay, I will just explain.
I know why. There were white letters on a black background.
That's right, white letters on a black background. I guess there's some translation issues in uploading it. No problem. So hope there's not a lot more of that. We'll find out as we go along. So what this slide had said was animal agriculture, climate change, and U.S. trade policy, which is going to be the focus of my presentation. But before I get to that, I want to add two notes. The first is that this is actually, if you can believe it, you'll be shaking your heads on that one once we get through it, a shortened version of this presentation. There was additionally a section that we'll be getting to that looks more at how exactly animal agriculture drives climate change, but we just don't have time for that tonight. But if you would like to see those slides, we will include the full presentation with our next newsletter, which is the follow-up email that will be coming out with the video to the call and lots of other useful resources. The other thing I'm going to tell you is you're not going to be able to read all the text on these slides. Don't even think you can. Don't even try it. That's okay. You're not even supposed to at this point. It would go way too fast. But you can read all that stuff when you look at the slides later on. So with those two notes, we can go on with the presentation. So there is a growing global consensus that animal agriculture is, as a major contributor to climate change, is an issue that needs to be tackled by a shift in diet, that we need to reduce our consumption of animal products in order to fight climate change. This is a broadly shared consensus. The image on the left on the previous slide represents a study by the paper by the United Nations Environment Program. On the right is research published in Environmental Research Letters. Next slide. Again, study after study has confirmed this point. On the left, you can see the results of research by the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, new findings presented to and the right new findings presented to the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Go ahead. Next slide.
Adam, you don't have to speak that fast. It's
okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're doing fine. Yeah.
The Royal Institute of International Affairs in the UK, Chatham House, has also confirmed this point, saying, again, that eating less meat is essential to combating climate change. And again, the point here is we're not just talking about changing agricultural practices. The consensus is that we actually need a shift in consumption practices to combat this problem. That point was actually confirmed by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. The lead scientist of the lead scientist of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that shunning meat is the most significant personal choice we can make to address climate change. The World Watch Institute in 2009 released a report suggesting that in fact previous reports had greatly underestimated the degree to which animal agriculture contributes to climate change. Animal agriculture is responsible for 51% of total climate change. Next slide. This new insight is starting to affect public policy. Governments are taking action in small and big ways. On the smaller end, Germany has now banned meat at official functions to set a good example for climate protection, which actually both meat and fish products. China, in a much more significant move, is actually taking policy steps to reduce meat consumption by 50%. Next slide. Now, how does the U.S. respond? On the one hand, we saw some sign of hope when a dietary guidelines board that advises the development of U.S. dietary guidelines said that it was critical for the U.S. to adopt language in the U.S. dietary recommendations addressing the need to reduce consumption of animal products both for health and climate reasons. Well, that suggestion was taken and largely ignored. That language was left out of the dietary guidelines. No mention of climate. In fact, it was suggested that that is not the sort of thing that should be considered in dietary guidelines. Next slide. And so the point that I'm trying to make with that introduction is to say that on the one hand we have a scientific consensus and that we need policy action towards shifting. First of all, we need a change in consumption practices, and second, that we need policy action to facilitate that change. But in the United States, we are ignoring those recommendations in terms of shaping public policy, and that is completely reflected in the way that we are addressing agriculture through our trade policy. So if we look, for example, at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if we can actually go back, TPP was the U.S. International Trade Commission report on TPP gave a very negative picture about what TPP would mean for U.S. industries. In just about every area studied by the U.S. International Trade Commission report, TPP was going to be a job loser, was going to not ultimately benefit U.S. industrial sectors, with one significant exception, portions of agriculture. And the big winners, according to the ICC, were going to be pork, dairy, chicken, and beef. So this trade agreement that was going to be bad for U.S. jobs, bad for our environmental rules, bad for access to medicines, was going to have one big winner, which is corporate animal agribusiness. And this was a point that was not lost on the Obama administration, which used this as a selling point for TPP. You can see Michael Froman here talking about how the chicken industry would benefit. Next slide. And again, across the board, in all the sectors of animal agribusiness described before, the Obama administration and others heavily pushed the idea that this would be a big winner for U.S. agriculture exports, for the exports of the corporate agribusiness that is so influential in shaping our public policy. Next slide. And you can see here, again, there's some black text cut off here, but you can see here some of the corporations and industry groups that are advisors on the Trade Advisory Council that whisper in the ears of our U.S. trade negotiators and have insider access to the negotiating documents of these texts while we, the people, are locked out. Next slide. This is directly from the National Pork Producers Council website, talking about how TPP would be beneficial to the pork industry. Next slide. Again, pork producers organized a major fly-in to D.C. to advocate their public policy interests, and TPP was issue number one. Here's a website. This is a page from the website that the beef industry created to push TPP. Next slide. Okay, so we lost some text
again. I don't know. It must have had a black background. I apologize.
Yeah, these are all black background slides with white text. No, it's okay.
Very
and
sorry
so
about
let's see if I can do this one from memory. Or I may have to open the original. I may need to take a moment to open my version, if y'all can bear with me for a moment. But while we'll just take a few seconds. Let's see if I can do that. Okay. Well, okay, let's see if I can just, I'll try and have to do this, just do this from memory. So the winning strategy for animal agribusiness has, in the U.S., has been an economy of scale facilitated by government subsidies, as Ben was talking about before. The animal agribusiness has created, the U.S. animal agribusiness has been able to create the world's cheapest animal products through subsidized grains, through the economy of scale facilitated by factory farming, and now is intent on through this high volume production, maximizing profits by expanding consumption. Next slide. And you can see the result of this high volume, cheap production has moved the U.S. to the top of global consumption in terms of animal product consumption. Next slide. But there's a problem. There's now more consumption than there are U.S. consumers to eat these products. The meat consumption actually started leveling off and even dropping within the last few years. That now seems to be plateauing a bit and turning around, but there is no real expectation that animal agribusiness is going to be able to reach its profit potential domestically. Their production capacity greatly exceeds the U.S. consumer base, even if they are able to move consumption up somewhat. Next slide. And this is also true for the cheese industry and dairy in general. Dairy is producing at a higher rate than there are consumers to consume. Next slide. So the alternative, the new opportunity, is pursuing global markets. As we saw previously, the U.S. is at the very top of global meat consumers, which means there are countries around the world to work on getting U.S. animal products into to increase consumption and increase corporate profits. Next slide. And so while the U.S. the U.S. and Australia are at the top of the list in terms of world consumers of animal products, they are not at the top when it comes to the rate of consumption change. Other countries are increasing their rate of consumption much faster, and the U.S. agribusiness wants to be tapping those markets. Next slide. And you can see here that you can see here the comparison between the rate of consumption increase in the U.S. versus the rate of consumption increase in China. Next slide. The countries where the U.S. is going to, the countries that pose the greatest opportunity, where we see consumption increasing the most, are not in fact developed countries. They're countries like China, Latin America, Southeast Asia. And so that's really where much of this new opportunity is being pursued. Next slide. Okay. So the U.S. has actually been quite successful. So with global meat consumption on a significant increase, unlike the U.S. consumption, which is plateauing, overall global consumption, U.S. consumption has been increasing during this time, but global consumption is going up and up with no end in sight. Next slide. And the U.S. has been quite successful in tapping a significant amount of those markets because the U.S. Produces cheap animal products. To the degree that the U.S. can access markets, the U.S. Will profit, and U.S. Production volume and profit will go up, despite the many awful practices that define U.S. animal agribusiness. So this was another black slide. So I will, and so what this slide talks about, let's see if we can take this one from memory, is the objective of corporate agribusiness, what is corporate agribusiness's objective with free trade agreements. Free trade agreements are a very significant tool for increasing market access. Because the U.S. has such low-priced animal products, if the U.S. can get into markets, the U.S. producers will win those markets. Factory farm producers will be able to factory farm producers selling subsidized products will be able to outcompete smaller domestic farms in countries worldwide. The problem for U.S. producers are tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers which can include things like food safety rules, animal welfare rules, import quotas. And so these are all obstacles to the U.S. capturing new markets that the corporate agribusiness has pushed free trade agreements in order to combat. Next. Yeah, so some of the tools that animal agribusiness has used to achieve these objectives are harmonization of sanitary and phytosanitary standards in trade negotiations themselves, creating one flat standard of food rules. That was a big fight with the, well, as we'll talk about later, with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, trying to bring European standards down to U.S. levels in terms of imports. Another big major tool is state-to-state challenges at the World Trade Organization. For example, a good example of that is when the U.S. sued Europe over refusing to import hormone-treated beef, or when the U.S. sued Europe over refusing to import chlorine-washed poultry. Another tool is, of course, investor states. Corporations having the power to sue governments in international tribunals outside the jurisdiction of their national court system when a corporation feels that a public interest policy stands in the way of their expected future profits. Yet another is procurement rules. Trade agreements potentially procurement rules, which can potentially include things like animal welfare standards for government purchasing of animal products, or other food safety rules, or other food rules that could potentially limit exports and market access opportunities for industrial producers. So next slide. Which of course is very. If you're the U.S. and you want to addict the world to products created in filthy factory farms, if you want to push an agenda of letting industry define the rules of what's considered to be safe products, harmonizing standards to what U.S. producers demand will create that market access that will allow you to expand your markets. Next slide. From that slide, U.S. pork with every new trade agreement, the U.S. pork, the value of U.S. pork has gone up. Trade agreements have been a key factor for increasing industry profits, and that, of course, is why animal industry groups pursue these trade agreements so effectively, so aggressively. Next slide. Right. And what you'll notice on that map is that there's a strong concentration of countries in Latin America. And if you remember from the earlier slide, the countries with with the major rates of increase in animal product consumption are primarily in East Asia and Southeast Asia and Latin America. So TPP, if we can go to the next slide, you'll notice ads in many of those Southeast Asian countries, in Asia-Pacific countries, that open the opportunity for expanding those new markets. Many of those countries that are so attractive to animal agribusiness in their agenda to attain market access and drive up rates of consumption. Next slide. So China, in the case of China, which was not part of TPP, we have already seen the effect of a free trade agreement in terms of consumption. So in 2000, President Clinton signed permanent normalization of trade relations with China. Next slide. And now what we all know is that since the passage of permanent normalization of trade relations with China, the U.S. has developed a massive trade deficit with China. We import far more from China than we export to China. But when you look at food, that's completely reversed. Our rate of exports have gone up significantly to China since the passage of permanent normalization of trade relations with China. In effect, what's good for, again, as we saw with TPP and the ITC report, what's good for animal agribusiness is bad for U.S. workers across the board in most other cases. TPP also was designed as a docking agreement with the idea that countries could be added later, and part of the overall strategy was for China to be for the U.S. to define the rules of TPP and then add China later, which certainly we can be sure was very attractive to animal agribusiness interests. I'm pretty sure everyone on this call knows, President Trump on his, next slide. President Trump on his the first Monday in office signed an executive order calling for the U.S. to be pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was ultimately implemented. This was bad news. Next slide. This was bad news for animal ag interests. Trump's agenda for trade and agriculture has been a real question. Animal agribusiness producers were very worried that because of Trump's rhetoric about bringing jobs back to the U.S., about rewriting trade agreements that hurt industrial jobs, that ultimately the benefits that they've accrued from those trade agreements might be lost. It is not clear, though, in looking at Trump's statements, that that is the case. The Trump administration has been very clear in saying that they intend to pursue new opportunities, new export opportunities for U.S. agribusiness via trade agreements. Next slide. So the animal agribusiness agenda for the Trump years is to pursue the key goals of TPP. Now that TPP is off the table, in smaller pieces. Through bilateral, President Trump has expressed interest in bilateral agreements. The meat and dairy and other animal agriculture industries want to ensure that there will be agreements with some of the most attractive countries that would have been in TPP and also, as we'll see, in TTIP. The other thing that they want to do is defend the benefits that they already accrue from trade agreements in existence, and we'll see more about that shortly. Next slide. So the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership was another trade agreement left over from the Obama administration. President Obama was negotiating a trade agreement with the entire European Union, and this trade agreement was it basically came to a halt in large part over food issues. The U.S. was pushing quote-unquote science-based standards, which basically often means industry science, and cost-benefit analysis, whereas the European Union used the higher standard of the precautionary principle, in effect saying you don't poison people first and then find out later. The U.S. producers wanted to eliminate Europe's higher food safety and animal welfare standards as barriers to U.S. exports. For the dairy industry in particular, geographic indications was a major issue. This is an issue of particular regions having exclusive right to the name of certain food products. This is a big issue with certain cheeses, for example, saying that a cheese can only have this particular name if it is from the traditional region where the cheese is produced. And over these conflicts, in part, TTIP negotiations never really, as of yet, haven't come to a conclusion. They're largely frozen, and some of these issues created a major outcry and led to mass protests in Europe. Next slide. So Animal Ag is still interested in TTIP, but it is unclear at this point whether there's going to be a TTIP to push, and as of yet, it's not clear that the U.S. agenda would win through TTIP anyway, that Europe would cave on these issues. So moving on to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Big Ag's agenda for NAFTA is essentially to, first and foremost, to make sure that there's no rollback. NAFTA was a windfall for U.S. producers, for U.S. beef exports to Canada and for U.S. beef exports to Canada and Mexico. For the dairy industry, we'll get to that in a moment. Next slide. And so you can read here a quote from the Director of International Market Access for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, talking about how NAFTA created $1 billion export markets for U.S. producers in both Mexico and Canada, and fearing that if President Trump really pushes for changes in NAFTA, the U.S. could lose these benefits. For the dairy industry, on the one hand, they want to keep the benefits that they gained with Mexico, but want to address the fact that ultimately they never achieved the kind of full liberalization with Canada that they wanted, would have wanted, and want to have a renegotiated NAFTA to mean greater dairy market access in Canada. The pork industry pretty much is saying they're fine with the NAFTA renegotiation as long as pork tariffs stay at 0. Next slide. So, and we can go to the next slide. And yeah, keep going. It should be the President Abe. Okay. So the U.S.-Japan Free Trade Agreement for animal, which is it has been actively discussed by the Trump administration. Japan was, of course, the most significant economy aside from the U.S. in TPP, the third largest economy on the planet, and of great interest to animal agribusiness interests. The most important country at the, for animal agribusiness in TPP. Next slide. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association and the National Pork Producers Council together wrote to President Trump talking about the importance of market access in Japan. Japan, at this point, offers strong protections to its domestic farmers with tariffs designed to protect the country's agriculture industry and to not put their domestic farmers at the mercy of international of untariffed international markets. Next slide. Similarly, Brexit has opened the door for a UK-US free trade agreement. The UK is the US's #1 trading partner in Europe, and with a right-leaning government in currently controlling the UK. Next slide. There is thought from animal agribusiness interests that this could be an opportunity to lower the food safety standards that the UK participated in through the EU, now that the UK is out of the EU, and create greater market access in the UK for the toxic products of mass production industrial factory farms. Next slide. So ultimately, the point here is that trade policy must prioritize climate change mitigation over agribusiness profits. The reason that this is not just about, the reason I'm focusing on U.S. producers here is not just because I hate U.S. producers in particular. It's because U.S. producers, by creating this economy of scale, by creating super low-cost animal products, are in place to facilitate this massive global shift towards increasing animal products further and further. To do to the world what was done to the U.S. You can look at the trend lines of animal product consumption in the U.S. through the 20th century. It went up enormously, and this wasn't just because people decided they liked meat a lot. It was because of the fact that prices went down as a result of subsidies and industrial agriculture. If the same thing can happen worldwide, the planet is literally cooked. Next slide. So very often when environmental campaigners are asked about this issue and asked really why more isn't being done to address the issue of animal agriculture, the response is there's a pretty typical response, and this is there's a quote from an article in Time magazine that was talked about the head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and his recommendation on reducing meat consumption. And he said, it's great for magazines to come up with 51 ways you can save the environment, but relying on individuals to voluntarily change their behavior is nowhere near as effective as political change aimed at speeding the transition to an economy far less carbon intensive than our current ones. Naomi Klein, who has been a speaker on these calls, has actually said, I do talk about the need to shift our industrial ag system to an agroecological one in the book, and I agree that a meat-based diet is unsustainable. I just don't see how you enforce vegetarianism, smiley face. And as I've said earlier, focusing on individual consumer behavior, whether it's changing light bulbs or going vegan, is just not going to get us there. Now, what these arguments ignore, strangely, is that food and ultimately consumer choices are intensely political and are not really just a matter of individual consumer choice. To suggest that they are is really to, in some ways, absorb neoliberal ideology. In fact, state intervention has a tremendous effect on consumer choice, and we in the trade justice movement know that because many of the fights we have seen, many of the ISDS cases and state-to-state cases that we address are about corporations trying to attack state policy designed to influence choice or state policy that affects consumer choices. Just a few examples, the cases around the ISDS cases around plain paper packaging of tobacco products and anti-tobacco rules, the WTO case around dolphin-safe tuna, the WTO case around country of origin labeling of meat, the WTO case around flavored cigarettes. We know that public policy can and does affect consumer choice. So it's puzzling that when we talk about an issue that is so profoundly important to affecting climate change, we reduce the issue down to, well, shucks, we can't tell people what to do individually. Clearly, the other side of this issue, animal agribusiness, is working on these policy shifts in order to drive consumption. They understand that policy affects consumption. It is puzzling and disappointing that on the environmental side, there doesn't seem to be that same insight. There are, in fact, policy actions that we can take, and many of them directly affect our work as trade justice activists. Instead of this race to the bottom, we need to say that if we are going to harmonize standards in trade negotiations, we need to push for upward harmonization. Instead of the lowest standards, we need higher food safety standards. We need stronger animal welfare rules. And even if those rules don't directly affect climate, what they do is eliminate the capacity for artificially cheap products. We're not making products cheaper and driving up consumption by giving people toxic food from abused animals. We need to end the implicit subsidy for factory farming in the form of grain subsidies that allow meat producers to produce animal products at artificially low prices. In contrast, we can provide subsidies for alternatives to animal products and other plant-based foods to make plant-based diets more accessible, which would also have major public health benefits. We can defend food sovereignty by prioritizing protection of small farmers and farming communities over market access for agribusiness corporations. When countries have tariffs designed to protect domestic agriculture, it should not be our policy objective to knock that down. We should not try to repeat what we did in Mexico when we destroyed the agricultural base of a nation and shifted the consumption patterns of a country, resulting in Mexico now having skyrocketing rates of obesity and diabetes as a result of being hooked on the extension of the standard American diet filled with processed foods, dairy products, the shift from corn to wheat tortillas, etc. We should protect our right to government procurement rules and not let trade agreements attack government procurement rules, so that we can have procurement rules that demand more climate-friendly products, so that we can have procurement rules placing restrictions on foods that are artificially cheap through low food safety standards and animal welfare standards and labor standards, etc. We can push for a carbon tax on animal products and use the revenue generated to fund public education efforts on the climate consequences of animal agriculture and the health benefits of plant-based diets. Chatham House, who I referenced earlier, did a study that found that of all the major causes of climate change, the biggest gap between public perception and actual impact is in the area of animal agriculture. The public perception of animal agriculture's impact on climate change was dramatically lower than the actual impact. And that was based on them using the lowball 14% figure of impact. If we use the 51% figure, then the gap is enormous. And it is critical that the public understands that our food choices have a profound impact on climate. Another option is shifting towards plant-based menus at public institutions like schools. That's something that's already been done in places like Oakland. So we can push for policy. Initiatives, and this is critical because in some ways, consumption shift around food is low-hanging fruit. Unlike in areas like energy, we don't need to focus on massive new infrastructure production. We don't need massive new technology. Simply transferring the arable land that we're already using for livestock crops to food to feed human beings could play an important role in mitigating climate change, actually addressing food scarcity and increasing global food supplies, fighting hunger, if we also, of course, work on more equitable distribution, and could increase global public health. This is a win-win-win strategy that is attainable. Next slide. And so we need to bring these points to our elected officials. We need to bring this issue into the conversation around U.S. trade policy. where it has certainly not been part of the conversation up to this point. We need trade policy that is climate responsible, and we need the agriculture component of our trade policy to not just be about increasing profits for the Smithfields of the world and for and expanding markets for factory farms, but actually shifting towards agriculture, towards trade policies that protect our global climate and not just corporate profits. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. So moving on to and shifting from my presentation to the broader point. Part of the reason we did this webinar this month is, first of all, the Earth Day is this month. Second of all, because on April 29th is the People's Climate March, potentially the largest climate march in history. There will be a major protest in Washington, D.C. There are also going to be smaller actions worldwide. If people want to talk about ways that we can help to raise some of these issues about the intersection of climate and trade, not only in the issues I addressed, but also the issues that Anthony addressed and the issues that Ben addressed and the issues we've heard about on other calls, I would be happy to be a contact point for people to coordinate. You can reach me. It's a little hard to read on the slide there, the green thing flipped, it looks like, at 718-218-4523 or by email at adam@tradejustice.net. And so let's definitely have those conversations over the next few weeks and make sure that trade is part of the conversation at the People's Climate March. Next slide. As most of you know, or as many of you know, every year we do a May Day call usually focusing on the connection between trade policy and migration. This year we're going to be doing a call called NAFTA and the Roots of Migration, while the Trump administration is pushing a NAFTA agenda, as we heard before, that is caught between the poles of neoliberalism and economic nationalism. We feel that it's important to talk about NAFTA in terms of global justice and global solidarity and attack and challenge Trump's agenda, Trump's argument that Mexico is the big winner of NAFTA, and really talk about the human cost of this disastrous trade agreement and why it drove mass migration from people who were forced to leave their country for basic survival in order to feed their families. So that will be on Sunday, April 30th, the day after the Climate March and right before May Day. You can register at tradejustice.net/callreg. Trade Justice Alliance, as many of you know, is a small project run by volunteers, and we need your help. Harriet mentioned before some of the people who work on these webinars. We are a small team. Paul Flansburgh is another one of our volunteers. But we need, in order to be able to really increase the effectiveness of these webinars, we need your help. We need you to help us recruit speakers. We need you to help us plan the webinars. We need you to help us publicize the webinars. We need help running the webinars. We need people who are good with technology so we can avoid the kind of problems we have had tonight and on many previous calls. So these are the consequences of being a small, short-staffed team. So we need your additional help. And something that we're doing is we're opening our weekly planning calls. These have been previously closed calls, but we're opening them up so people can join us. They're every Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. And for those of you in audio only, I'll just tell you the number. It's 712-770-4160. I'll say it again. That's 712-770-4160. The PIN is 556999#. And yeah, it's just very much like getting on these calls. And you're welcome to join us. There are lots of ways people can help, whether it's if you want to reach out to congressional staff and encourage them to watch the videos of these webinars or come on the webinars, whether you want to organize community screenings of the webinars, whether you want to reach out to more organizations and encourage them to co-sponsor the webinars. There are lots of ways that people can help. Whether you want to do promotion on social media, we can really do much more with these webinars and increase their capacity as an organizing tool with your help. Another way that you can help us, and this is the first time we've made this request on one of these webinars, is to make a donation. We do have a PayPal button set up that you can, or PayPal link set up that you can use, tradejustice.net/TJA-donate. There are costs that go into the technology used to promote these webinars and run these webinars, and we certainly could use that help, and with more funds, we could further increase our capacity and do even more. Again, that's tradejustice.net/TJA donate, all lowercase.
Thanks, Adam. I wanted to give a shout-out to our team member, Carrie Marks. She does an awful lot of work, including she does all the technology as far as the YouTube videos go, and she helps us out in a lot of areas. So I just wanted to give a big thank you to Carrie. She's really a great addition to our team. And we wanted to thank all of you also for joining us. We realize there are a lot of things you could be doing on Sunday evenings, and we wanted you to know that we really appreciate your sticking with us all these years. So thank you very much. And Adam, is there anyone else that has a question, or should we just open the lines up?
Let me take a look. I'll see if there are questions. Okay. Let's see. Here's a comment. A wonderful presentation in Powell River. Let's see if there's a question again. In Powell River, British Columbia, Canada, we are practicing sustainable agriculture. We're working towards a blue community, changing to a plant-based healthy diet. I'll just add a comment on that, which is the question of what sustainable animal agriculture would look like is a real dilemma, because on the one hand, one of the problems of intensive animal agriculture is you're concentrating animals, creating manure lagoons, breeding disease, introducing industrial chemicals that end up in effluent, hormones, antibiotics, etc. The flip side is that industrial animal and also producing at high volume and low cost, which drives up consumption, The flip side is that more extensive farming systems, open pasture systems, consume more land, and in the case of cattle, actually per animal have a higher carbon footprint. Livestock per animal. Cattle produced in the U.S. actually have a far lower carbon footprint than cattle in the developing world. So ultimately, this is why the recommendations that I mentioned before are fairly consistent. That we need to go beyond that. While there are certainly changes that we can make in agricultural practices, ultimately the key is going to be an overall reduction in consumption of animal products, and a shift towards diets that are higher in plant-based foods. Comment from, that's just a comment, not a question. Looking back to see if there are any other questions. Not seeing any other questions. Anyone else want to add a question? Okay, great. So I guess that's it for questions. So 45. Thanks, everyone. And
Thank you.
I'll turn
Maybe
off the
we'll open the phone line. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your sticking with us.
Thank you, everybody. It was a great conference call. All the speakers really had a lot to say that was interesting and informative. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Harriet. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you.
Okay.
Everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Appreciate it.
Bye.